The Concordat spire had been built to make visitors feel small, and it had been doing that job for 11,000 years. It hung above the dead star ossuary like a needle driven through a black pearl, 40 kilometers of white stone and mirrored alloy, and every one of its 200 galleries had been shaped by architects who understood exactly one thing about power, that it is mostly a matter of ceilings. The great chamber of the Galactic Council had a ceiling you could not see. It simply went up and kept going, until the eye gave up and the mind quietly agreed to behave. Wren Adeyemi had learned, in her 14 months on the station, not to look up. She sat in the last row of the Terran delegations box, which was the smallest box on the 4th tier, wedged between the Ilvani and a species called the Gam who communicated by changing the temperature of their skin, and who therefore made the entire row uncomfortably warm whenever they were bored. She was 24 years old. She was the third delegate of the Terran mission, which sounded impressive until one learned that there were only 3 delegates, and that the third one's duties consisted mainly of carrying the seal case, correcting the timestamps on filings, and standing behind the ambassador looking calm. She was good at looking calm. It was, in fact, the only diplomatic skill she had ever been formally praised for. Below, on the council floor, the Centennial Accession Review was in its 9th hour, and the Vehl Ascendancy was taking its time. They always took their time. The Vehl were tall and pale and elegantly jointed, with the long grave faces of statues that had learned to walk, and they had been the arbiters of the conquered for 4,000 years. Not the strongest power, not the richest, but the oldest continuous signatory, which in this chamber was the only currency that never inflated. When a Vehl spoke, 8 other delegations of the sovereign bloc arranged their bodies into whatever their species used for agreement. When a Vehl paused, the chamber waited. Speaker Vehl Ascendancy was pausing now. He stood at the rostrum of instruments with his hands folded into the sleeves of a robe the color of old bone, and he let the silence spread out across the floor like water finding its level. And then he said, in a voice that never needed to be loud, "The Council will now turn to item 41, the standing of the Terran Compact." Wren's stomach did something small and cold. Beside her, Tamaz Ibera, the mission's archivist, did not move at all. He was 68, with the flat gray patience of a man who had spent his life among documents, and he had been the one to whisper to her 3 days ago that item 41 had appeared on the agenda overnight, sponsored by the Vehl, seconded by the juror, with no advance memorandum and no draft findings circulated. That was not how the council worked. That was how an ambush worked. Down on the floor at the Terran station, Ambassador Ilina Sarkis rose. She was 71. She had been a war crimes prosecutor before she was a diplomat, and she stood the way she had stood in courtrooms, squarely, without ornament, a woman who had long ago decided that a straight spine was a complete argument. "The Terran Compact acknowledges the item," she said, "and requests, as is customary, the text of the finding before debate." "There will be no debate," said Vehl Ascendancy. The chamber stirred, not much, just enough. "Speaker," said Sarkis with respect. "There will be no debate," he said again, and turned, and the rostrum's great lens bloomed with light, and the finding appeared across the chamber's air in 900 languages at once, and Wren read it in the 10th, in plain Terran script, and felt the blood leave her face. Finding of the Council, provisional and immediate, that the polity known as the Terran Compact, admitted to the conquered under emergency protocols 83 standard years past, was admitted in error, that the compact does not meet the threshold of sovereign consequence, that the compact's population is properly classified as custodial, a service-bearing population under the protection and direction of the sovereign bloc, that the compact's delegation shall henceforth sit not as a party but as a petitioner, that all credentials issued to the Terran mission under the sovereign schedule are, from this hour, void. And then, beneath it, in the small crabbed script that the Vehl used for the parts of a document they considered merely administrative. That the Terran station shall be vacated. That the Terran delegation shall be received, if it wishes to be received at all, in the Petitioner's well. Wren had walked past the Petitioner's well every single day for 14 months without ever once thinking about it. It was a circular depression in the floor of the chamber, 6 meters across, sunk 1.5 meters below the level of the council ring, ringed by a low rail. It was where client species came to beg. It was where the ungoverned came, and the shattered, and the ones whose worlds had been burned out from under them, and who had nowhere left to file a grievance. It was designed so that anyone standing in it had to look up at everyone else, and anyone standing at the rail had to look down. It had not been used in 60 years. The council was proud of that. The Terran delegation, said Vehl Ascendancy, may descend. Nobody moved. There is a particular quality of silence that only exists in very large rooms full of very old creatures, and it settled over the great chamber now, and in it Wren could hear her own heartbeat, and the faint tick of the gong beside her going hot with interest. Ambassador Sarkis stood at her station with her hand flat on the desk. Speaker Anam, she said. 83 years ago, this council asked the Terran Compact to hold the threadway relays through the Kelm decoherence, because no other species could survive the interval. 19,000 of our people went out into the dark to hold those lanes open, and 1,100 did not come back, and the lanes stayed open, and every ship in this chamber's fleets flew home along them. I stood in this room when the council thanked us. I am not going to stand in a hole in the floor. Something moved across Vehl Ascendancy's long face. It might have been pity. It might have been nothing at all. Ambassador, he said, your credentials were voided 4 minutes ago. You are not addressing this council. You are simply speaking in a room. And then he did the thing that Wren would remember for the rest of her life. The thing that was worse than the finding, worse than the well, the small, unnecessary thing that told everyone watching exactly what was being said. He gestured, and a Vehl clerk crossed the floor to the Terran station, and lifted the seal case from the desk. The case Wren carried every morning, the case with the mission's credentials in it, 83 years of them, the writ of accession, the ratification instruments, the little worn silver seal die that had been struck in Mombasa the year humanity was admitted, and the clerk turned the case over and emptied it onto the floor of the council. The sound it made was very small, a scatter, a skittering. And the chamber laughed. Not all of it. It was not a roar. It was worse than a roar. It was a ripple of dry, delighted, well-bred amusement from the sovereign block's benches, the sound of a room full of ancient creatures being tickled, and it went on for perhaps 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, Wren Adeyemi understood something about the galaxy that no briefing packet had ever managed to teach her. They did not hate humanity. Hatred would have been a kind of respect. They found humanity funny. Sarkis did not bend to pick up the credentials. She looked at them on the floor for a long moment, and then she looked up at the rostrum and she said, in a voice that carried, "Note the hour." "The hour is noted," said Vehl Ascendancy indulgently, "as all hours are." "Good," said Sarkis. Then the Concord's marshals came, 2 of them, enormous armored rude with courteous manners and no capacity for discretion whatsoever, and they escorted the ambassador of the Terran Compact out of the great chamber of the Galactic Council, and the second delegate, Marguerite Bell, went with her, because Bell's credentials had been issued under the same schedule and had died in the same 4 minutes. And the Terran station stood empty, and the council prepared to move to item 42. It was Tamaz Ibera who put his hand on Wren's wrist. She had not stood up. She had not been aware of intending to stand up. But her hands had gone to the arms of her seat, and Ibera's fingers were on her wrist, dry and light, and he was leaning in with his eyes fixed on the empty desk below, and he was saying, very quietly, without moving his lips very much, "Wren, your credential." "What?" Your credential, he said. You were seated late. You were credentialed in the supplementary schedule 14 months ago, because the sovereign schedule was closed for the audit cycle and they had to slot you under the clerical annex. His voice was perfectly flat and his hand was shaking. Wren, they voided the sovereign schedule. They didn't void the annex. They didn't even look at the annex. She stared at him. There is, said Tamaz Ibera, still a credentialed representative of the Terran Compact in this chamber. Down on the floor, the rostrum's lens was already reshaping itself for item 42. The delegation had begun, with the sublime insensitivity of the very comfortable, to hand around a tray of small, warm cakes. Wren Adeyemi sat very still for exactly 6 seconds. Later, people would write a great deal about those 6 seconds. Playwrights would fill them with soliloquies. Historians would fill them with strategy. Both were wrong. What was actually in Wren Adeyemi's head during those 6 seconds was, in order. Her mother, who had sat a threadway relay station in the long quiet for 6 years, alone, because the interval killed every other species that tried it and humans only went strange in it, and who had come home with a tremor in her left hand that never left and had never once complained about it. Not one time, not ever. Her brother Kayode, who had died at 29 in a quarantine ward on Kelm, holding the hand of a Vehl child, because that was his job, and because he had been the kind of man who did his job. And the sound the credentials had made hitting the floor. And then, quite clearly in her grandmother's voice, you will not give them the thing they came for. Because they had come for a scene. That was the whole architecture of it. Wren saw it entire in one cold, complete flash, the ambush agenda, the voided credentials, the well, the emptied case. Every piece of it was designed to make a human being lose control in front of the assembled galaxy. Shout, weep, threaten, storm out. Because a human shouting in the great chamber would prove the finding true, and the finding would harden into precedent, and precedent in this room was forever. They had built a very expensive trap, and it had exactly one door, and the door was labeled Rage. So she did not go through it. Wren stood up. She stood up in the last row of the 4th tier, a young woman in a plain gray mission coat with her hands empty, and she said, in a voice that was not loud and did not shake, "Speaker, point of order." The great chamber of the Galactic Council did not, at first, understand that it had been interrupted. Vehl Ascendancy turned. He looked up. He found her, a small figure very far away, and there was, for one instant, an almost human flicker of confusion on that long, grave face. "This chamber," he said, "recognizes no Terran voice." "This chamber," said Wren, "recognizes supplementary credential 4991, issued under the clerical annex, countersigned by the registrar of the conquered, current, unexpired, and not addressed by the finding the speaker has just entered." Silence. Then a dry rustling from the registry gallery, where Keeper Nadan Osek, a reed of the Osek High, 4 meters of gray segmented patience, the council's registrar for 200 years, was consulting the ledger. All 8 of the keeper's manipulators moved at once. Somewhere down there, a page turned. "The credential exists," said Keeper Osek. Their voice was like wind through a dry hedge. "It is current. The finding did not address it. The finding voided the sovereign schedule. This credential is annexed." Vehl Ascendancy's hands came out of his sleeves. "Then it is voided also," he said, "by extension. By obvious intent." "The registry," said Keeper Osek, with the flat serenity of a being who has outlived 900 speakers and expects to outlive this one, "does not recognize intent. The registry recognizes text." And there it was. Wren felt it go through her like a swallow of cold water, not triumph, nothing so warm as triumph. Just a click, somewhere behind her sternum, the sound of a very large machine engaging. "Speaker," she said, "the Terran Compact does not contest the finding." That got their attention. Every head in the chamber, every eye cluster and sensor frill and heat plate turned toward the fourth tier. "Say that again," said Vehl Ascendancy. "The Terran Compact does not contest the finding," Wren repeated. "We will not debate it, we will not appeal it. We will not ask this council to reconsider it." She let a small breath out. "We accept it, every word of it." A murmur ran the length of the sovereign block's benches, and it had a shape, and the shape was too easy. "Then descend," said Vehl Ascendancy softly, "and take your place in the well and petition us." "No," said Wren. "You have just accepted." "I've accepted the finding," she said. "The finding says we are not a party. A petitioner petitions for something. There is nothing the Terran Compact wishes to petition this council for." She paused, and in that pause the chamber leaned very slightly forward, the way a room does when it senses it has missed a step on the stair. "The well is for asking." "We're not asking." She looked down at the floor of the chamber, at the little scatter of silver and paper lying where the clerk had dropped it, 83 years of a species signature, spilled like grain. "Speaker Ascendancy," said Wren Adeyemi, "the council has found that Earth was admitted in error, that we never met the threshold, that our accession was void from the beginning, and that we have sat here all this time as something less than a signatory." Her voice stayed exactly level. "The Terran Compact accepts that finding and thanks the council for its clarity, and will now act in accordance with it." "Act," said Vehl Ascendancy, "in accordance with it." "Yes." "And what does that mean?" And Wren Adeyemi, 24 years old, the most junior credentialed being in the room, standing alone in the back row of the fourth tier with her hands folded in front of her, because she had learned in her first month that folded hands do not shake, said the thing that 4,300 delegations would spend the rest of the century trying to explain to their grandchildren. "It means that a party without standing," she said, "was never bound." The chamber did not react, not yet. It takes a certain amount of time for a very old and very confident room to hear a sentence like that. "It means," she went on, "that every instrument the Terran Compact has signed in 83 years was signed by a polity that this council has now ruled had no capacity to sign. Every treaty, every protocol, every charter, mandate, concession, and standing obligation." She tilted her head slightly. 4,109 instruments, Speaker. The Registry will confirm the number. It's a large number. We've been very busy. Down in the Registry gallery, Keeper Osek had gone entirely, absolutely still. "The Terran Compact will file instruments of denunciation on all of them," said Wren. "Tonight, in person at the Registry counter as the form requires. Signed and sealed under the only valid Terran credential remaining in this Concord, which the Speaker has been kind enough to leave me." She gathered her coat. "Under Article 9 of the Charter of Kasserine, a denunciation takes effect at first light over the seat of government of the withdrawing party. The seat of the Terran Compact is at Mombasa, on Earth. Sunrise there is in 11 hours and 40 minutes. She began to move along the row toward the aisle. Delegates got out of her way without seeming to decide to. "Girl," said Vehl Ascendancy, and for the first time in 4,000 years of Vehl composure, something in his voice had a crack in it, hairline fine. "Do you understand what you are doing?" Wren stopped at the head of the stairs. "Speaker," she said, "I understand exactly what you've done." And she went down to the Registry to begin. The Terran mission occupied 4 rooms on the spire's 31st gallery, above a noodle shop run by a family of Gom, and below a storage vault that hummed at a frequency that gave humans headaches. It had a window. The window was the mission's single luxury, and it looked out at the dead star ossuary, which was not much of a view, but which had the advantage of being enormous and free. By the time Wren got there, the corridor outside was full of Vehl. Not soldiers. Vehl clerks, 6 of them, in the pale gray of the Ascendancy's protocol service, standing in a courteous line along the wall with their hands folded, doing nothing at all. It took her a moment to understand what they were for. They were there to be seen. They were there so that everyone walking the 31st gallery would see that the Terran mission was being watched, the way one watches a small animal that has bitten someone and now has to be dealt with. It was theater. Everything the Veil did was theater. That was, Wren was beginning to understand, both their great strength and the entire shape of their weakness. She walked past them without hurrying and without slowing, and she said, "Good evening," to each of the six, and then she went inside and closed the door and leaned her forehead against it for exactly 3 seconds, and then she straightened up. Ambassador Ilina Sarkis was sitting at the long table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She looked, for the first time in the 14 months Wren had known her, old. "They're saying," Sarkis said, without turning around, "that a Terran child stood up in the 4th tier and told the council she was going to burn the treaty stack." "I didn't say burn." "No," Sarkis's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. "No, apparently you were extremely polite. Marguerite has watched the recording 9 times. She says you sounded like a librarian issuing a fine." "Ma'am." "Sit down, Wren." Wren sat. Marguerite Bell was at the comms bench with 3 feeds open and her hair coming out of its knot. Tamaz Ibarra was already at the far end of the room with the vault doors open, and behind him, rising in the dim light, was the thing the mission called the Black Stack. It was not black and it was not really a stack. It was a wall of ledger drawers, 40 of them, floor to ceiling, containing physical counterparts of every instrument the Terran Compact had signed since accession, because the Conquered, in its immense and fossilized wisdom, did not consider a treaty to exist unless there was a sealed physical counterpart lodged with both parties and a third with the Registry. 83 years of paper and vellum and Vehl bone leaf and Jura press crystal. 4,109 instruments. Ibarra was standing in front of it with a hand light, and he was not moving. "Tamaz," said Wren. "I've been the archivist of this mission for 22 years, Ibarra said to the drawers. "I have touched every single one of these. I know which ones are heavy." He turned around. His eyes were red. "Do you know what's in drawer 19? Drawer 19 is the Threadway Tender Convention. Do you know what's in drawer 31? "Tamaz." "The Silent Mandate," he said. "Drawer 31 is the Silent Mandate." Sarkis set her cup down. "All right," she said. "Marguerite, doors, nobody in, nobody out, and assume the walls are listening because they are." She looked at Wren. "You talk. And talk carefully, because in about 90 minutes I am going to have to explain to the Terran Compact why its most junior delegate has committed the entire species to the largest unilateral withdrawal in the recorded history of the galaxy. And I would very much like to have a reason." "You already know the reason," said Wren. "I want to hear you say it out loud." So Wren said it out loud. "Standing," she said. "Everything in this Conquered runs on standing. A signature only binds if the thing that made it had the capacity to be bound. That's not a human idea. It's Article 2 of the Charter of Kasarine. It's 4,000 years old. It's the first thing they teach in every legal academy from here to the rim. Capacity precedes obligation." She spread her hands flat on the table. "The Veil just stood up in front of the entire council and ruled, on the record, in the strongest language they could find, that Earth never had capacity, that we were admitted in error, that our accession was void from the beginning." "They meant it as an insult," said Sarkis. "They meant it as a leash," said Wren. "They wanted to reclassify us as custodial so they could direct our labor instead of paying for it. They wanted the relay tenders under block command instead of Terran contract. They wanted the registry escrow moved into Veil hands. They wanted us kneeling, and they thought the fastest route to kneeling was humiliation, because humiliation is how you break an old species." She looked up. "It is how you break an old species. It's been working on the Ilvani for 600 years. It's why the GOM won't speak in plenary anymore. It works." "But not on us," said Marguerite Bell from the comms bench, with a hard little edge in her voice. It works on us fine, said Wren. That's the point. Half the mission is downstairs crying right now, Marguerite, and so am I, on the inside at approximately the volume of a fire alarm. She said it flatly, without self-pity, and Belle shut up. It works. It just doesn't only do the one thing. They reached for a leash and they picked up a key, and they picked it up in front of 900 witnesses, and they read it into the permanent record, and the registrar has already confirmed it in open chamber. She turned her hands over. The finding is the withdrawal. It does the work for us. We don't have to argue a single point. All we have to do is agree with them. The room was very quiet. Agree with them, said Sarky slowly. Completely, enthusiastically, in writing, 4,109 times. Ibera made a small sound, and Wren realized with a shock that the archivist was laughing. A horrified, helpless, wheezing laugh, one hand over his mouth. They'll reverse it, said Belle. The second they see what's coming, they'll reverse the finding. They'll say it was provisional. They can't, said Wren. Not in time. A provisional finding of the council can only be vacated by the council, in plenary, with a quorum of the sovereign bloc plus 2/3 of the general benches. The plenary is in recess until the review closes. It closes in 6 days. She let that sit. And even if they somehow reconvene tonight, the denunciations will have been filed by then. Under Article 9, once an instrument of denunciation is accepted by the registry, its effect is fixed. It runs to sunrise. The council can't call the sun back. Sarkis got up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to the room, a small square woman in a rumpled coat, looking out at a star that had died before any of them were born. You understand, she said, what we're actually withdrawing from? Yes, ma'am. Say it. The Threadway Tender Convention, said Wren. 11,400 human tenders sitting relay stations along 19 jump corridors, because the transit interval, the long quiet, is neurologically survivable for exactly one species in the Concord, and it isn't the Vehl. If we withdraw, the tenders come off station. Beacons drift. Corridor coherence decays in about 30 hours. 19 lanes go dark, and every fleet, freighter, grain convoy, and mail packet in the near galaxy is suddenly 6 years from home instead of 6 days. Go on. The Registry escrow instrument. 311 interspecies clearing systems run through the Terran ledger at Kilimanjaro, because in the trade wars nobody would let anybody else hold the books, and then somebody suggested giving them to the new species that nobody had any history with and nobody was afraid of. We hold the escrow for 80% of interspecies debt in the Concord. If we withdraw, we don't seize anything, we just stop. The ledger freezes. Nobody can prove title to anything. Credit in this Concord ends at sunrise, not because we broke it, but because we were the ones holding it up and nobody ever noticed. Go on. The Kelm custodial protocols, said Wren, and her voice did something very small on the word Kelm. The quarantine wards, the burn wards. The hospice ships on the plague worlds. 9 species can't tolerate their own contagion protocols. Their physicians die faster than their patients. Ours don't. We staff every long-term quarantine facility in the Concord. 22,000 medics and orderlies and grave tenders. She stopped. And, said Sarkis. And the silent mandate, said Tamaz Ibera, quietly from the dark by the black stack. Sarkis turned around. 2,000 human witnesses, Ibera said, standing in the detention archipelago of the Vehl Ascendancy. In every camp, on every rock, in every processing station where the Vehl hold the populations of the worlds they've pacified. Unarmed. Powerless. They do nothing but watch and write down what they see and sign it. And the Vehl's rivals, the Jur, the Echelon, the whole Rimward League, accept those signatures. They've accepted them for 60 years. He came forward into the light. It's the only reason there's been no war over the archipelago, not because the Vehl are trusted, because we are. A Vehl camp with a human witness in it is a camp the galaxy believes about. A Vehl camp without one is an atrocity, said Sarkis, by default, by assumption, instantly and everywhere. She sat back down rather heavily. God in heaven, they'll be at war inside a month. Not our war, said Bell. No, said Sarkis, it won't be. And there it was, the thing that was going to sit in the room with them all night. The thing Wren had been carrying since the fourth tier, heavy and cold and not going anywhere. She stood up. Which is why, she said, I want to be extremely clear about what this is before we file a single instrument. Because there is a version of tonight where we do this as revenge, and I need everyone in this room to understand that I will resign publicly in the Great Chamber before I let it be that. Marguerite Bell stared at her. They emptied your seal case onto the floor. Yes. They laughed. Yes, said Wren. I heard them. I'm going to hear them for the rest of my life. She put her fingertips on the table lightly. And if we do this as revenge, if we go out there and tell the galaxy we're pulling out to punish them, if we gloat, if we threaten, if we so much as smile, then everything that happens afterward belongs to us. Every dark lane, every frozen ledger. Every ship that doesn't come home. They'll write it down as the year the humans got angry and the conquered burned, and they'll be right, and in 100 years the well will be full of our grandchildren. Then what is it? Said Bell. Compliance, said Wren. She said it so simply that it took a moment to land. We are complying, she said. The Council has ruled that we lack the capacity to bear obligations. We are respectfully ceasing to bear obligations. We are not punishing anyone. We are not asking for anything. We are not even objecting. We are doing precisely, exactly, and completely what the Galactic Council has instructed us to do, and we are doing it politely and on time and in writing. She looked around the room. And they will not be able to bear it. Sarkis had begun, very slowly, to smile. A thin, terrible, prosecutorial smile that Wren had seen exactly once before, in an old recording, in a courtroom, 30 years ago, in the 90 seconds before a defendant confessed. Quiet, Sarkis said. Ma'am. That's the whole weapon, isn't it? Quiet. The old woman shook her head slowly. They're insured against loud. Loud they know. Loud they've handled for 4,000 years. A species screams and the block calls it instability and the block votes sanctions and the screaming species is a client state inside a decade. It's a machine, Wren, and it only takes one fuel. She tapped the table. Don't give it any. No, ma'am. Not tonight, not tomorrow. Not when they come to you at 3 in the morning and tell you what you are. Sarkis's eyes were fierce and wet. They will come to you, you know that. They'll send someone gentle first, then someone frightening, then Anam himself, and he will be magnificent, and he will offer you the sun and the moon and a chair at the high table, and he will do it in a way that makes taking it feel like maturity. And you will be 24 years old and exhausted, and the entire species will be watching. Wren was quiet for a second. Then I'd better not sit down, she said. At 1940 station time, the Terran compact answered. It took the form of a single burst on the mission's diplomatic channel, routed through the Kilimanjaro Ledger House, authenticated with the compact's deep seal, and it was 4 lines long, and Marguerite Bell read it aloud twice because the first time her voice broke. To Third Delegate Wren Adeyemi, Acting Head of Mission, Concordat Spire. The compact has reviewed the finding. The compact does not contest it. Proceed with denunciation of all instruments. File them all. Carry yourself well. Sunrise AT Mombasa is 0614. You have 11 HOURS and 20 minutes. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Tamaz Ibera went to drawer 1 and opened it and lifted out the first bundle of counterparts and set it on the trolley. They loaded 4 trolleys. It took 2 hours. The instruments had to go in registry order, not chronological order, which meant Ibera had to rebuild 83 years of filing on the floor of the mission house at midnight. on his knees, in his shirt sleeves, calling out numbers while Bell checked them against the ledger, and Sarkis wrote out the seal forms in her long prosecutor's hand because Wren's hand, it turned out, was not quite steady enough for calligraphy. "You'll have to read every one aloud," said Ibera at some point without looking up. "That's the form. The registrar can't accept a denunciation that isn't spoken. Title, date, parties, and the words of renunciation. 4,109 times." "How long?" He did the arithmetic on the back of a seal form. "If you don't stop," he said, "and if you don't stumble, and if the registrar doesn't slow you down, 9 hours, 40 minutes. Wren looked at the clock. "Then we should go," she said. At 22:05 station time, the doors of the Terran mission opened, and 4 trolleys came out, and the 6 Vehl clerks in the corridor turned to watch, and the youngest of them, a slight one, barely past its second molt, actually stepped back. Wren Adeyemi walked at the front. She had changed her coat. She had eaten half a sandwich because Sarkis had stood over her until she did. She carried nothing but a small dark notebook and the supplementary seal, which was tin and dented, and had been struck by a machine in a Nairobi basement for a clerical annex nobody had ever expected to matter. The gallery outside the registry was already crowded. Word had moved through the spire the way word moves in a place where nothing ever happens, badly, wildly, and fast. There were Jur in their trade silks. There were H-Lon. There were 3 Gom glowing a nervous ochre. There were journalists from 11 feeds and a great many junior attachés who had come to see the human girl cry. Keeper Nadan Osek waited behind the registry counter, gray and segmented and unreadable, with the great ledger open and 8 manipulators poised. The counter was chest-high. It had been built for species taller than humans. Wren had to stand very straight to see over it, and she did. "Registrar," she said, "the Terran Compact wishes to file instruments of denunciation." "How many?" said Keeper Osek. "All of them," said Wren. And she opened the first bundle. The Conquered had a word for what happened at the registry counter that night. It did not have the word beforehand. It made one afterward because it needed one, and the word it made was a reed word, an Osekai word, and it translated badly into every language in the galaxy. The closest anyone ever got in Terran was the reading. It began at 22:11 station time. "Instrument 1, said Wren Adeyemi. "Convention on the Mutual Recognition of Ports and Berths, signed at Kasarine, year 83 of the current cycle. Parties, the Terran Compact and the Conquered of the Galactic Council, all signatories exceeding." She laid the counterpart flat on the counter, pressed the tin seal into the wax analog, and turned the document so that it faced the registrar. "The Terran Compact, having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa." Keeper Nadan Osek's manipulators moved. A stamp came down. The great ledger turned a page. "Accepted," said the registrar. "Entered 2211. "Instrument 2, said Wren. "Protocol on the carriage of perishable cargo through decoherent space." At first it was funny. That is the thing that the histories always get wrong, and Wren always corrected in later years when people asked her. For the first 2 hours, the gallery outside the registry was a party. Delegations came down to watch. They brought drinks. The Vehl protocol clerks stood along the back wall in their pale gray with the particular smugness of people who have been sent to observe a tantrum and have found, instead, a farce. Junior attachés from 6 worlds took bets on how long the human would last. Somebody nobody ever found out who, though Marguerite Bell maintained to her dying day that it was a Jur, started a chant, low and rhythmic, in the back of the crowd, a nonsense syllable timed to each stamp of the registrar's seal. Wren did not look up. "Instrument 61. Agreement respecting the loan of Terran surveyors to the H-Lon Deep Survey. Parties, the Terran Compact and the H-Lon Confederacy. The Terran Compact, having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa. Accepted, entered. Instrument 62. Memorandum on the Standardization of Air Mixtures in Shared Habitats. Her voice was the thing. Everyone who was there said so afterward, in every language, in every account, in the memoirs of 9 delegations. It was the voice. It did not rise, it did not fall, it did not hurry. She read each title as though it were the only document in the galaxy, and she had all the time there was, and she said the words of renunciation the same way every time, exactly the same way, with the same small pause before Mombasa, and after 90 minutes of that the chanting stopped, and after 2 hours the drink stopped, and by hour 3 the gallery outside the Registry of the Concordat spire had gone as quiet as a chapel. Because they had started to listen to the titles. That was the thing nobody had planned. Wren certainly had not planned it. It simply happened, because the form required her to state the subject of each instrument aloud, and there were 4,109 of them, and hour by hour, in a flat, unhurried voice, a 24-year-old woman was reading the galaxy, an inventory of everything human beings had quietly been doing for it for 83 years. Instrument 304, standing undertaking to provide ice rescue crews to the GOM outer shelf. Instrument 305, standing undertaking to maintain the orphan beacons of the Vehl drift. Instrument 306, agreement respecting the recovery and repatriation of war dead from the Meridian fields. At Instrument 306, a juror in the third rank of the gallery sat down on the floor. Instrument 440, convention on the provision of neonatal care to the Ilvani diaspora. Instrument 441, convention on the provision of neonatal care to the Ilvani diaspora, supplementary, respecting the blind wards at 7. The Ilvani arrived at hour 4. They came in a slow file, 30 of them, small and stooped and eyeless, feeling their way along the wall with the delicate cane fingers of their forelimbs, and the crowd parted for them without being asked, because nobody in the Concord had ever quite worked out how to be rude to an Ilvani. Their delegate, Sesh Karin, came to the counter and stood at Wren's left shoulder, and did not speak and did not touch her, and simply stayed there. The Ilvani had no eyes. They knew the world by sound. Sesh Karin had never seen a human face in their life and never would. They stood at Wren's shoulder for the next 7 hours. Instrument 912, Wren read. Charter of the Threadway Tender Service, Article 1, Parties, the Terran Compact and all Concord signatories without exception. The gallery made a sound. The Terran Compact, said Wren, having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa. The registrar's manipulators did not move. There was a pause, perhaps 4 seconds, and in the ancient stillness of Keeper Nadan Osek, something happened that no one in the Concord had witnessed in 200 years. The registrar hesitated. Registrar, said Wren gently. Accepted, said Keeper Osek. Entered 0241. The lanes. Everyone in that gallery understood what had just gone into the ledger. 19 jump corridors, the arteries of the near galaxy, held open by 11,400 human beings sitting alone in relay stations through an interval of dimensionless silence that turned every other species in the Concord into a screaming animal inside 40 minutes. There had been a war about it once. There had been a Vehl expedition, a proud one, and the Ascendancy did not talk about what had come back. Somewhere at the back of the crowd, Azure Treaties was doing arithmetic on a slate, very fast, and making a small repetitive noise. Wren picked up the next bundle. Instrument 913, Charter of the Threadway Tender Service, schedule of relay stations, corridors 1 through 19. They sent the gentle one at hour 5. Her name was Vehl Ascendancy, and she was the speaker's grandniece, and she was Wren estimated perhaps 30 in human terms, which for a Vehl meant barely adult. She came to the counter with a tray. On the tray was a cup of something hot, and a small dish of the sweet white cake the Vehl served at accession ceremonies, and a folded cloth. "Delegate," she said, "you have been standing for 5 hours." "Yes," said Wren. "Instrument 1106. Agreement on the sharing of meteorological data." "My great-uncle sends his regard," said Vehl, "and asks that you rest. The Registry will hold your place. Nothing will be lost." Parties: the Terran Compact and the Ascendancy of Vehl. The Terran Compact, having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa. "Accepted, entered." "Delegate," said Vehl, and her voice had changed, "please." Wren turned her head and looked at her and saw she was 24. She was not made of stone. She saw it clearly, a frightened young person holding a tray. "Thank you," said Wren, "truly. Tell the speaker that the Terran mission is grateful for his courtesy." She took the cloth and used it to wipe her hands and gave it back, folded, and did not touch the cup. Instrument 1107. Agreement on the sharing of meteorological data, supplementary, respecting storm warnings to Vehl coastal settlements. Vehl Ascendancy stood at the counter with her tray for a long moment. Then she walked away, and she did not walk like someone who had failed. She walked like someone who had understood something and did not want to be the one to carry it upstairs. At hour 6, the Third Delegation asked the Registry a formal question. They did it properly, through a clerk, in writing, and the question was this: in the event of denunciation of the Registry escrow instrument by the Terran Compact, upon whom does the clearing function devolve? Keeper Nadun Asek read the question. Then the registrar did something that would be quoted at the reckoning session and in 9 parliaments, and in the founding statutes of 2 new institutions. The registrar answered in open gallery, aloud, so that everyone could hear. "Upon no one," said Keeper Asek. "There is no successor named. There was never a successor named. Every party to the escrow instrument refused, in year 4 of the negotiation, to permit any other party to hold the ledger. The Terran Compact was appointed because it was the only signatory that no signatory feared." The registrar's manipulators folded. If the compact withdraws, the escrow does not transfer. It ceases. All positions held in clearing at the moment of lapse are unresolved and unprovable. Title cannot be demonstrated. Debt cannot be discharged. Somebody in the gallery said, very distinctly in jure, a word that the translation array declined to render. "There are," Keeper Asek added, "at present in clearing, instruments to the value of approximately 940 trillion standard units." The gallery emptied. Not all of it. The Ilvani stayed, and the Gom stayed, and a great many junior people stayed, the ones with nothing to protect. But the senior benches went all at once in a great silk rustle of panic, and Wren heard them go, and did not look up and read on. Instrument 1502. Undertaking respecting the custodial wards at Kelm. Her voice did not change. Tamaz Ibera, standing behind her with the trolley, watched her hands and saw that they were perfectly steady, and he never forgot it because he knew what was in that drawer, and he knew who had died in that ward. Parties: the Terran Compact, the Ascendancy of Vehl, the Hlan Confederacy, the Gom Shelf Assembly, and 6 further signatories. The Terran Compact, having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa. "Accepted," said Keeper Asek, and the ancient voice was not quite even. "Entered." They sent the frightening one at hour 7. He was a rude, one of the marshals, and he did not say anything at all. He simply came and stood 2 meters behind Wren's right shoulder, armored, enormous, silent, with the deliberate looming physicality of a species that has never in its history needed a second argument. He stood there for 80 minutes. Wren read 340 instruments in those 80 minutes. She did not once acknowledge that he was there. At the end of it, the Rood made a low sound in his chest, an entirely involuntary sound, as it turned out, and one that caused a certain amount of diplomatic embarrassment afterward, because among the Rood it is the noise a warrior makes at a funeral when the dead were brave. Then he went away. At hour 9, Speaker Vehl Ascendancy came down to the registry. He came alone. That was the first surprise. He came without clerks, without the block, without the great bone-colored robe. He wore a plain traveling coat, and he crossed the empty gallery with his hands out of his sleeves, and he stopped 3 paces from the counter and waited to be noticed. Wren finished the instrument in front of her. Instrument 3618, Protocol on the Preservation of the Names of the Dead, Parties, all conquered signatories without exception, the Terran Compact. Delegate Adeyemi. Having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa. Accepted, entered. Only then did she turn. Vehl Ascendancy looked at her for a long moment. 9 hours. Her voice was a ruin. She had lost the top of it around hour 6 and was reading now from somewhere low and raw in her chest. Her feet had swollen in her shoes. There was a bright red mark across the heel of her right hand where the tin seal had been driven into it 4,000 times, and it had begun, at some point in the last hour, to bleed, and she had wrapped it in a strip torn from the hem of her coat and gone on. She stood straight. She had been standing straight for 9 hours. "You have not sat down," he said. "No, Speaker." "Why not?" Wren considered the question seriously, because he had asked it seriously. "Because there's a chair," she said, "and if I sit in it, someone will say I was tired. And then the story will be about whether the human was tired." Her ruined voice was perfectly courteous. "The story isn't about me." Vehl Ascendancy closed his eyes. "I am going to say a number to you," he said, "and I would ask you to hear it before you refuse it, because I have never in 4,000 years of my family's service said a number like it to anyone." He opened his eyes. "The council will vacate the finding tonight. I will convene the block under emergency prerogative, and I will vacate it myself from the rostrum, and I will state on the record that it was made in error, and that the Terran Compact is and has always been a sovereign party of the first rank, admitted lawfully, seated rightfully. I will strike the word custodial from the record of the conquered. I will, and here something happened in the long grave face, something that cost him more than the rest of the speech together. I will go down into the well myself and stand in it and say so." The registry was absolutely silent. "And in exchange," he said, "you will stop reading." Wren looked at him. She had thought about this moment. She had been thinking about it for 9 hours because Sarkis had told her it was coming, and because she was not a fool, and because there was a part of her, a large part, a young and tired and terribly human part that wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to say yes. To be told in front of the whole galaxy that they had been wrong. To watch him climb down into that hole in the floor. She could have it, it was right there. She had only to put the paper down. "Speaker," she said, "may I tell you what my mother does for a living?" He said nothing. "She sits a relay station," said Wren. "Corridor 11, Station 4, 6 years alone in the long quiet. She has a tremor in her left hand that she'll have until she dies." She turned her hand over, the bandaged one, and looked at it. "When I was 9, I asked her why she did it, and she said, because the ships come home." Wren looked up. "She didn't say because of the treaty. Nobody ever said because of the treaty, Speaker. Not one human being in 83 years. "Then what are you doing?" said Vehl Ascendancy, and his voice cracked right down the middle in front of the Registrar of the Conquered. "What is this? You told the galaxy that we were only here because a piece of paper said we could be," said Wren, "and that the paper was a mistake, and everybody laughed." She set her bandaged hand flat on the counter. "So we're giving you back all the paper, every sheet of it, and then everyone can see what was actually holding this up." She turned back to the ledger. "Instrument 3619, she said. "Protocol on the preservation of the names of the dead, Schedule 2, respecting the Vehl fallen of the Meridian Fields. Delegate. Parties, the Terran Compact and the Ascendancy of Vehl. The Terran Compact, having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa." "Accepted," whispered Keeper Nadan Osek, entered. Speaker Vehl Ascendancy of the Vehl Ascendancy stood in the empty gallery of the Registry for a while longer. Then he went away, and he did not go back to his chambers, and nobody in the Ascendancy could find him for 6 hours. At 05:51 station time, with 23 minutes remaining until first light over Mombasa, Wren Adeyemi lifted the last bundle from the last trolley. Her voice was almost gone. Seshkaran of the Ovani stood at her left shoulder where they had stood all night, and Tamaz Ibera stood behind her with his hands full of paper and tears running down his face. And Ambassador Ilina Sarkis stood at the back of the gallery with her arms folded, and the gallery itself filled again, and then some, packed to the walls with every delegation in the Conquered, standing in absolute silence, did not make a sound. "Instrument 4109, Wren said. She had to stop, she breathed. "The silent mandate," she said. "Parties, the Terran Compact and the Ascendancy of Vehl. The Terran Compact, having been found by this council to lack the capacity to be bound, renounces this instrument in whole, without reservation, effective at first light over Mombasa." The tin seal came down. "Accepted," said the Registrar of the Conquered, entered 05:59. And Wren Adeyemi put her hands on the counter and lowered her head and stood there and breathed, while behind her 900 delegations of the Galactic Council watched the clock. Sunrise came to Mombasa at 06:14, as it had every morning for 4 billion years, indifferent and enormous, a red line laid down flat across the Indian Ocean. It was witnessed, that morning, by more non-human eyes than any dawn in the history of Earth. Every feet in the Conquered had picked up the Terran Compact's public astronomical relay, because the Compact, with a bureaucratic literalism that would be studied for centuries, had simply left it open, unencrypted, and pointed at the horizon. There was no commentary. There was no anthem. There was a beach, and a shipping channel, and a stand of casuarina trees bent by the monsoon, and the low white dome of the Compact Assembly with its doors shut for the night, and the sea. 900 delegations of the Galactic Council watched the sun come up over a fishing town. At 06:14 and 11 seconds local, the light touched the roof of the Assembly, and 4,109 instruments ceased to exist. Nothing exploded. That was the part the Conquered never quite got over. There was no fleet, no ultimatum, no darkening of the sky. There was a sunrise, and somewhere in the registry of the Concordat spire, a very old reed turned a page, and then, across 19 jump corridors and 300 worlds and 11,000 relay stations and 22,000 quarantine wards, human beings looked at the time and stood up and went home. The threadway went first. It went the way a bridge goes when the last cable is unbolted, not all at once, but in a slow arithmetic of failure that anyone could have predicted and nobody had. At 06:14 Mombasa time, relay tenders on 19 corridors keyed their stations to standby, logged the handover, addressed it to no one, because there was no one to address it to, and walked to the airlocks. Corridor 11, Station 4. A woman with a tremor in her left hand set the beacon to drift, put her mug in the sanitizer, wrote in the log the same 4 words she had written every morning for 6 years. All lanes open, held, and then underneath in the same neat hand, lane closed. No successor. And she went out to the tender ship. Beacon coherence in a threadway corridor has a half-life of roughly 31 hours without a living mind at the anchor. This was not a secret. It was in the literature. It had been in the literature for 83 years, in a monograph that had been cited 11 times, all of them by humans. By the second sunrise after Mombasa, 4 corridors had degraded past navigable tolerance. By the third, 11. By the 6th, all 19 were dark, and the near galaxy, which had, for the better part of a century, been a place where a azure grain hauler could leave Kessender at dawn and make the ossuary markets by the following dawn, discovered that it was, in fact, extremely large. A H-LON cruiser squadron on patrol 6 lanes out from home became, in the space of 4 days, a squadron 19 years from home. The Vehl Ascendancy's second fleet, the pride of 4,000 years, 31 capital ships, the instrument by which the block had held the rim quiet since before humanity had radio, was, at the moment of the lapse, deployed forward at the Meridian anchorage. The Meridian anchorage was reachable by exactly 1 threadway corridor. The second fleet did not surrender or fall or fight. It simply stopped being relevant, which for a fleet is worse. It sat at anchor, 31 ships and 110,000 crew, and the corridor went soft around it, and the Ascendancy's naval staff calculated the sublight return and produced a number, and then, according to 3 separate accounts, calculated it again, because the first number had been 41 years. The ledger went second. The Kilimanjaro clearinghouse did not close. That was important. Wren had been very clear about it, and the compact had listened. The doors stayed open. The staff came to work. They simply stopped clearing, because the instrument that authorized them to clear had lapsed, and they had no lawful authority to touch another species' property. And so the great slow river of interspecies debt, 940 trillion standard units in transit at the moment of the lapse, arrived at Kilimanjaro and stopped there and sat. Cargoes in the corridors had no provable owner. Insurance contracts that referenced the escrow could not be triggered, because triggering them required a clearing certificate, and no one alive could issue one. The azure trade houses, which had spent 3 centuries building an economy of pure velocity, in which no one owned anything for longer than 9 hours, woke up on the second morning to discover that they now owned everything permanently and could prove none of it. The azure exchange suspended trading on the 3rd day and did not reopen for 8 months. And the silent mandate lapsed at 06:14, and 2,000 human witnesses walked out of the detention archipelago of the Vehl Ascendancy. They walked out politely. They had been briefed. They shook hands where the species involved shook hands. They signed off their final logs and lodged them with the Registry as the form required, and took nothing with them but their own coats, and they filed onto the transports, and they went. And the galaxy looked at 41 camps on 19 rocks, holding 1.5 million pacified souls, with no witnesses in them. Nothing changed inside those camps, not on the first day. The Vehl were not monsters. That was never the point, and Wren had known it, and it was precisely why the thing worked. The camps ran exactly as they had run the week before, under exactly the same officers, with exactly the same rations and exactly the same rules. But there was no longer anyone in them whose signature the azure believed. The Rimward League's demand for immediate inspection arrived at the Ascendancy's foreign ministry 11 hours after the lapse. The H-LON demand arrived 13 hours after that. The GOM Shelf Assembly, which had not sent a note to anyone in 40 years, sent one. By the end of the first week, the Ascendancy had received 19 separate demands for verified access, and could satisfy exactly none of them, because verified in the Concord had meant, for 60 years, verified by a human being standing in the room, and there were no human beings standing in any room anywhere in Vehl space, because the Council of the Galaxy had ruled that human beings lacked the capacity to be bound. The Vehl Ascendancy, the oldest continuous signatory, the arbiter of the conquered, the fixed point around which 4,000 years had turned, discovered on the 8th day after Mombasa that its honor had been, for 6 decades, an entirely human product, imported, unremarked, and now unavailable. Speaker Vehl Ascendancy said one sentence about it, later, at a hearing under oath, and it was the only sentence anybody ever quoted. "We did not know," he said, "that we were being carried." The council reconvened on the 4th day. It reconvened in emergency plenary, under the Charter's oldest prerogative, which had been invoked 6 times in 4,000 years, and never for a matter that did not involve a fleet in transit. The great chamber was full to the ceiling that no one could see. 900 delegations, every gallery. The corridors outside were packed with clerks standing on chairs. The Terran station on the council floor was empty. It had been swept and polished and left empty, and nobody had dared to sit in it. The Terran Compact had, as required by the finding, sent a petitioner. Wren Adeyemi came into the great chamber at the appointed hour, and she came alone, and she walked down the long floor of the Council of the Galaxy in a plain gray coat with her right hand bandaged, and she went to the petitioner's well, and she stepped down into it. The chamber made a sound like a held breath being let go all at once. They had not expected it. That was the whole of it. After everything, after the night at the counter, after the lanes going dark and the ledger freezing and the Ascendancy tearing itself open on the rocks of its own vanity, they had assumed, every one of them, that when the humans came back they would come back to take the high seat, to stand at the rostrum, to make the block kneel in the hole in the floor and film it. Instead, a 24-year-old woman climbed down into the well and stood at the bottom of it and looked up at them, calmly, with her hands folded, exactly as the finding required. "The Council," said Wren, in a voice still raw enough to hurt, "has ruled that the Terran Compact is not a party but a petitioner. The Terran Compact does not contest the ruling. It has complied with the ruling in full." She looked around the great ring of benches, unhurried, taking her time, the way he had taken his. "It is standing where the ruling says it must stand. It has come to say 3 things, and then it will go." Speaker Vehl Ascendancy was at the rostrum. He had aged in 4 days in a way that Vehl did not age. "Delegate," he began, "the Council wishes first to—" "The first thing," said Wren, "is a correction to the record." Nobody stopped her. Nobody in that chamber in that moment could have stopped her with a fleet. "The Council has been told for 4 days that Earth has taken the lanes hostage. That Earth has seized the ledger. That Earth is starving the Ilvani and grounding the Second Fleet and opening the camps." Her raw voice was very quiet, and 900 delegations leaned in to catch it. "The Terran Compact wishes the record to show that Earth has done none of these things. Earth has not moved one ship. Earth has not touched one credit. Earth has not laid a hand on a single asset belonging to any species in this conquered, and Earth will not." She let the silence run. "Every relay station is standing, undamaged, fully provisioned, with its manuals in 900 languages on the table by the door. The Kilimanjaro house is open. The staff are at their desks. The archives are unsealed. Nothing has been taken. Nothing has been broken." She lifted her bandaged hand slightly. "We simply stopped," she said, "because you told us we had no capacity to be bound, and you were right that we were never bound. We were never bound at all." She looked at Vehl Ascendancy. "We were only ever willing." The great chamber of the Galactic Council did not make a sound. "The second thing," said Wren, "is about Kelm." And she reached into her coat and took out a single sheet of paper and held it up and read it. And this was the moment, this, and not the night at the counter, whatever the poems say, that the conquered never recovered from. "This is not a treaty," she said. "It is not an instrument. It cannot be filed, it cannot be enforced. It creates no obligation on any party, and the Terran Compact will not sign it, because the Terran Compact has been found to lack the capacity to sign." She turned it around so they could see that it was one page handwritten. "It is a notice. At first light this morning, Terran hospital ships returned to the custodial wards at Kelm, at 7, at the burn stations of the Vehl Drift, and at every long-term quarantine facility in this Concord that requested them. 22,000 medics went back. They went back on Earth's account, at Earth's expense, under no flag, with no protections, with no legal status whatsoever, in a jurisdiction that has ruled they are a custodial population with no standing before any court." She lowered the page. "If they are harmed, no treaty avenges them. If they are detained, no treaty frees them. If they die there, and they will, 940 of them have died in those wards in 83 years, and one of them was my brother. No treaty says their names." She folded the paper once and put it back in her coat. "They went anyway," she said. "This morning, before I came here, they didn't ask the council's permission and they didn't ask mine." Somewhere in the upper galleries, an Ilvani began to keen, a long, high, unbearable note, the sound that species makes at the death of a child or the birth of one, and cannot help, and never apologizes for. "You believed we were doing it for the treaties," said Wren. "That was the mistake. That was the only mistake in this entire chamber, and it wasn't ours." She was not shouting. She had not raised her voice once. "You believed that when you took the paper away, we would stop. You believed the paper was the reason." Her chin came up. "The paper was never the reason. The paper was just the part you could understand." At the rostrum, Speaker Vehl Ascendancy of the Vehl Ascendancy put one long hand over his eyes. "The third thing," said Wren, "is what the Terran Compact wants." 900 delegations braced. They had all done the arithmetic by now. They had done nothing but arithmetic for 4 days. They knew what she could ask for. She could ask for the rostrum. She could ask for the block's dissolution and get it inside a week. She could ask for tribute, for the Ascendancy's rim concessions, for a permanent human veto over the Concord's every act, for the Vehl to stand one by one in this same well and say what they had done. And there was not one delegation in that chamber, not one, that would have voted against her. The juror had already drafted the motion. It was sitting in the registry, waiting, with 211 co-sponsors. Wren Adeyemi stood at the bottom of the hole in the floor with her hands folded. "Nothing," she said. The word went out across the chamber and did not come back. "The Terran Compact is not petitioning this council," said Wren. "It has nothing to ask of you. It is not seeking readmission. It is not seeking reparations. It is not seeking the seat or the rostrum or an apology, and I want that noted with particular care, Speaker, because I know what it cost you to offer one at the counter, and because I am not going to let anyone in this room turn what happened here into a debt." She glanced up at the benches. "A debt could be paid, and then it would be over, and then we would all be exactly who we were." She turned slowly in the well, taking in the whole ring of them. "Earth will be at Kelm," she said. "Earth will be at 7 and the Vehl Drift and the blind wards, because our people are already there and they are not coming home. Everything else, the lanes, the ledger, the escrow, the beacons, the witnesses, the rescue crews, the grain, the names of your dead, everything else is gone. It lapsed at sunrise. There is no treaty. There is no obligation. There is no capacity." Her voice did not tremble. "There is only whatever any of you can persuade a free people to do, one thing at a time, in daylight, as equals, having asked." She put one foot on the step of the well. "That is all the Terran Compact came to say." And Wren Adeyemi climbed out of the petitioner's well of the Galactic Council and turned her back on the sovereign block and began to walk the long floor toward the doors. She got 4 paces. Then in the upper gallery, 30 small eyeless creatures rose to their feet. The Ilvani do not applaud. They have no hands to strike together and no eyes to shine. And for 600 years the conquered had taken their silence in the galleries as the natural condition of a small, sad, conquered people who had been given a seat as a kindness and knew better than to use it. What the Ilvani do is stand and hum. It is a low sound, produced somewhere in the throat sac, tuned by ear to the voice of the one being honored, and it is used exactly once in an Ilvani life, at the grave of a person who kept a promise that cost them everything and who never mentioned it afterward. It has no translation. The array in the great chamber, which could render 900 languages into 900 others, tried for 4 seconds and then printed, across the entire ceiling of the Council of the Galaxy, in every script the conquered possessed, the only words it had. "We heard you." Seshkarin of the Ilvani stood in the gallery, eyeless, small, stooped, with their cane fingers folded on the rail, and hummed at the precise pitch of a young human woman's ruined voice. And then the Gom stood. They went white, not their pale, nervous ochre, not their angry red, but white, the color a Gom turns exactly once, at the moment their children are named, a color the conquered had seen perhaps a dozen times in 4,000 years, and never in that chamber. They stood in their row, all of them, radiating a heat you could feel 3 tiers away, saying nothing, because the Gom had not spoken in plenary since the bloc had laughed at their accent 40 years before. Then the Hlan, then the Vehl, then the reeds of the Registry, which was flatly unconstitutional, and Keeper Nadan Osek did it anyway, all 8 manipulators lifted. Then the juror, whose exchange had just closed, whose trade houses were 900 trillion units underwater, whose entire civilization had been assembled out of the velocity that human relay tenders made possible, and who now faced a decade of sublight and ruin. The jur delegation stood up in a rustle of trade silk, and their chief delegate, a stout old creature named Orek who had bet 3 drinks that morning on how long the human would last at the counter, stood with tears running out of every socket in his head. 900 delegations of the Galactic Council rose to their feet for a species that had, 4 days earlier, been laughed at in that room. Wren Adeyemi stopped in the middle of the floor. She did not turn around. Everyone who was there agreed on that, and the recordings agree, and it is the detail that the poems always get wrong, because the poems all have her turning around. She did not. She stood with her back to 900 standing delegations and her face to the doors, and her shoulders came up very slightly once and went down again. Then she walked out. The rest of it took 11 months. That is the part nobody wants to hear, and it is the part that mattered. There was no grand reconciliation, no single golden hour in which the galaxy was made whole. There was, instead, 11 months of the most exhausting, undignified, patient, granular diplomacy in the recorded history of the conquered, and the Terran Compact conducted every hour of it in daylight. The rules were simple, and Wren had set them in 9 words in the well, one thing at a time, as equals having asked. So they asked. They had to. There was no other door, and because there was no treaty and no framework and no standing machinery and no sovereign bloc to arrange the outcome in advance, every single species in the conquered had to come to a small office on the 31st gallery of the Concordat spire, above a noodle shop, and sit in a chair, and ask human beings for something and give a reason. The jur came first, on the 6th day, because the jur were nothing if not quick. They did not ask for the escrow back. Orek, who had done the arithmetic and understood, before anyone else in the conquered, precisely what had been done to them and precisely who had done it, asked for something else entirely. He asked whether the Terran Compact would consider, at some point, if it were ever convenient, sitting down with the jur and 11 other trade polities to design a clearing house that did not depend on anyone's kindness. "You want us to build you a system," said Wren. "That means you never need us again." "Yes," said Orek. Wren thought about it for 4 seconds. Yes, she said. It took a year, and it was called the Mombasa Instrument, and it was the first treaty humanity signed after the lapse. It runs to 9 pages. Every previous escrow instrument in the Concord had run to 1100. The difference, the lawyers said afterward, was that the old one had been written by parties who did not trust each other, and the new one had been written by parties who had been made honest by catastrophe. The lanes came back one at a time. Not as a right, not as an obligation, corridor by corridor negotiated separately, each one a public agreement between the Terran Compact and the specific polities that used it, with terms, with limits, with a price, and the price was never money. Corridor 11 reopened in the 4th month. The Terran negotiators asked, in exchange for the return of the tenders, that every polity using the corridor place 3 of its own citizens at the relay station alongside them. Not to sit the long quiet, they could not. That was never in question, but to be there, to see it, to bring the food up, to watch a human being go out alone into the interval that would kill them in 40 minutes and come back 6 months later with a tremor, and to know, in their own bodies at close range, what the ships coming home actually cost. The Vehl Ascendancy sent 900. They sent the children of their great houses. They had to be told twice that this was not a punishment. Wren's mother trained the first Vehl class herself. She was not gentle about it. She was 53 years old, and she had a tremor in her left hand, and she taught them how to make tea in a station galley at 0 gravity, and how to log a beacon drift, and how to sit still. And one of them, a slight young Vehl, barely past her 2nd molt, named Vehl Ascendancy, turned out to be extraordinarily good at it. The camps were the hardest. There was no clean ending there, and Wren never pretended otherwise. The Ascendancy's detention archipelago did not open in a day. It opened over 4 years, under a verification regime that the Vehl themselves proposed and the Vehl themselves paid for, staffed by witnesses from 11 species. Because the Terran Compact, asked to resume the silent mandate, had declined. You don't need us, Wren told the Ascendancy's delegation, in the small office above the noodle shop, with the ossuary hanging dead and enormous outside the window. You need someone you can't corrupt and can't threaten and doesn't want anything from you. That was us for 60 years, and it was very convenient for everyone, and it let all of you go on not building the thing yourselves. She slid the file back across the desk. Build it yourselves. They did. It took 4 years. It is called the Standing Verification, and it is the only institution of the Concord that has never once been accused of bias, and it has 14 human members out of 600, and they are there because they were elected, and for no other reason at all. The Council never reconstituted the sovereign bloc. It did not have to be abolished. It simply stopped meeting, the way a thing stops meeting when everyone in it has quietly stopped believing in it. And by the 2nd year, the old bench where the 9 had sat was being used as an overflow gallery for junior clerks, and by the 4th year somebody had put plants on it. The petitioner's well was another matter. There was a motion in the 8th month, sponsored by the GOM and seconded by 240 delegations, to demolish it, to fill in the hole in the floor of the great chamber and lay the stone flat and be done with it forever. It came to Wren, because everything came to Wren by then, and she was 25 years old and very tired and running a mission of 4 people out of 4 rooms. She wrote back 1 paragraph. It was read into the record, and it is carved, now, in 900 scripts, around the rim of the thing it saved. Leave it, Wren wrote. Fill it in, and in 11,000 years someone will build another one, because the impulse that dug it isn't in the floor. It's in us. Leave it open. Leave it empty. Let every delegation that walks into that chamber have to walk around it, and let them look down into it on their way to their comfortable seats, and let them remember exactly what this council thought was funny. The well is still there. It has never been used again. In the 9th year, a Gam child on a school tour asked her mother what the hole was for, and her mother said, "It's for us." Speaker Vehl Ascendancy resigned in the 5th month. He did not go quietly, and he did not go loudly. He gave one final address from the rostrum of instruments, 4 minutes long, in which he did not defend himself once, and then he entered the record a full accounting of the drafting of item 41. Every meeting, every sponsor, every calculation, his own included, in a clear hand, naming himself first. It ended 9 political careers. His own had ended already. He came to the small office above the noodle shop on his last day in the spire. He came alone, as he had come to the registry, and he stood in the doorway, and Wren stood up, because she had been raised to stand up when an elder came into a room, and she saw no reason to stop now. Delegate Adeyemi. Speaker. Not for another 2 hours. He looked around the 4 rooms, the trolleys, the empty ledger drawers of the black stack standing open and bare, the window with its dead star. I have been trying for 5 months to understand what you did to us. I have concluded that you did nothing to us at all, and that this is the entire difficulty. Yes, said Wren. I have also been trying to understand the other thing. He came in 1 step. Why you went back to Kelm, before the plenary, before you knew whether we would break or whether we would simply hate you. His long, grave face was unreadable, and then, suddenly, was not. You had every card in the galaxy in your hand that morning. And you spent your first move on the one thing that could not possibly help you. Wren looked at him for a moment. My brother's name was Kaode, she said. He died in the ward on Kelm when I was 15. There was a Vehl child in the next bed who was going to die too, and the child was frightened, and my brother went and sat with her, and that's how he took the infection, and that's what killed him. She said it evenly, the way she said everything. The child died anyway. 6 days later, her name was Ishtem. My brother wrote it in the log, because that was the protocol, and then somebody in the Ascendancy's clerical service wrote him a letter of thanks that was very beautiful and mentioned the treaty 3 times. Vehl Ascendancy stood very still. He didn't do it for the treaty, said Wren. He didn't even do it for her, really. He did it because he couldn't have lived with himself otherwise, and neither could anyone else on that ward, and neither could I, she shrugged, a small movement. That's all humanity is, Speaker. It isn't a threshold. It isn't consequence. It's a species that can't stop showing up. You spent 83 years thinking you'd bought that with paper. You hadn't. You'd just been standing next to it. The Speaker of the Vehl Ascendancy, 4,000 years of continuous signature, bowed to a 25-year-old woman in a mission office above a noodle shop, all the way down, in the manner in which a Vehl bows exactly once, to a house older than their own. We did not know, he said, that we were being carried. I know, said Wren, that's the part I forgive. The Terran Compact never rejoined the conquered. That is the last thing people forget, and it is the most important. There was no restoration. Earth did not go back into the seat. The seat stayed empty. It is empty today, polished on the council floor, and the Concord's registrar keeps it dusted for reasons the registrar has never explained. Instead, there is a table. It stands where the sovereign block's bench used to be, and it is round, and it seats 9, and any polity in the Concord may take a place at it for the duration of a single negotiation, and must give the place up when the negotiation ends. The Terran Compact holds no permanent seat there. Neither does anyone else. Every treaty humanity has signed in the 22 years since the lapse has been signed at that table, one at a time, in daylight, after being asked. There are 11 of them now, 11 where once there were 4,109. The Concord's lawyers say the 11 are worth more. Ambassador Ilina Sarkis went home. She lived 9 more years and wrote a memoir which is very short and mostly about her garden, and in the whole of it she mentions the night at the registry exactly once, in a single line near the end, which reads, "The child never sat down, and neither in the end did we." Tamaz Ibera stayed. He is still there in the archive room above the noodle shop, 89 years old and entirely deaf in one ear, and he keeps, in the first ledger drawer of the empty black stack, 4,109 cancelled counterparts, each one stamped with a dented tin seal. Visiting delegations ask to see them. He always says yes. He always makes them stand while they look. And Wren Adeyemi went home. She went home in the 14th month, when the last corridor reopened, and the Mombasa instrument was signed, and the standing verification took its first oath, and she resigned her credential, Supplementary 4991, Clerical Annex, the most consequential document in the history of the Concordat Spire, and gave it back to Keeper Nadan Asek across the same counter, and the registrar took it in 8 manipulators and held it for a long moment before entering it in the ledger. "Accepted," said the registrar of the conquered. "Entered." "Thank you, Keeper," said Wren. "Delegate," the old reed's dry-hedge voice stopped her. "In 200 years I have entered 11 million instruments into this ledger. It is not permitted for the registry to have an opinion." A pause. "The registry has one." Wren waited. "You were not a petitioner," said Keeper Nadan Asek. "You were never a petitioner, not for 1 hour of that night." She came down to earth on an ordinary passenger lift, in an ordinary coat, and nobody met her at the port, because she had asked nobody to, and she took the coast road out to the town where the assembly was, and she got there in the dark. She walked out to the water. It was cold, and the monsoon was coming, and the casuarina trees were bent flat along the beach the way they had been bent in the feed that 900 delegations had watched. On the morning the paper stopped, and a fishing boat was going out with a lamp on its bow. She sat down on the sand with her ruined shoes in her lap and her scarred right hand around her knees, and she waited, because there was nothing else left to do, and nowhere else in the galaxy she had to be. At 06:14, the sun came up over the Indian Ocean. It came up on 19 open corridors and 11 honest treaties and 41 empty camps, and a hole in the floor of the great chamber that no one would ever be made to stand in again. It came up on a species that had been laughed at by the assembled galaxy and had answered by putting down its paper, 1 sheet at a time, for 9 hours without once raising its voice. And it came up that morning on a young woman sitting alone on a beach, unrecognized, unguarded, 25 years old, watching the light come across the water exactly as it had on the morning she gave everything back. They had wanted her to weep in the well, and she had not. They had wanted Earth to beg, and it had thanked them instead and complied, and gone quietly out into the dark to keep doing the hardest thing in the galaxy for free. That was the lesson the conquered finally learned, and it cost them 4,109 treaties to learn it. Humiliate a people and you will find out, very fast and very publicly, exactly what they were doing for you, and whether they were ever doing it for you at all. Wren Adeyemi watched the sun clear the horizon and stood up, and brushed the sand from her coat and went home.